Did you know that the Neorican movement is a cultural and intellectual movement involving poets, writers, musicians, and artists who are Puerto Rican or of Puerto Rican descent and live in or near New York City? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about Puerto Rican literature with award-winning author JL Torres on this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll explore the life and work of author JL Torres. But first, a trivia question. Where is the largest Puerto Rican community outside of Puerto Rico? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have JL Torres on the show today. JL was born in Puerto Rico and grew up in the South Bronx. He returned to Puerto Rico to find his roots and material for his writing. He's lived in Madrid, Chicago, Los Angeles, and in Barcelona as a Fulbright scholar. He has freelanced for magazines and newspapers. He has also published a string of stories in small magazine and is a published poet. A retired university professor, JL is currently focusing on his fiction writing. When I learned about JL's fascinating work, my curiosity was immediately piqued and I wanted to learn more. I hope this interview with JL will spark your curiosity too. Welcome to the show, JL. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
What's the most important thing that I should know about you?
Well, I think the most important thing, obviously, because I write about Puerto Ricans, is that I was born in Puerto Rico. I'm Puerto Rican, and I'm also a writer, but I also was a professor at the university level for 40 years.
Wow. So I've been a professor also. Obviously, I'm the Curious Professor, but I'm not even up to my 20 years yet. So I have a lot of admiration for you.
I started when I was 27 or so. So I've been around for a while and at it. It was not my first choice, oddly enough. I didn't really want to teach, but once I got the teaching bug, I really was hooked. I had to continue doing it. It took me a while to get my doctorate, I did later. And so I went through all the steps, and 40 years later, I retired and now I'm devoting myself to writing.
And what made you take that step to retirement?
Well, a lot of factors. Part was this pandemic. Last year was not the best for me. I am a classroom teacher. I love the engagement with students, and it was just so strange to see boxes on the screen. And of course, I don't know. I'm sure you've gone through this too, and teaching, remotely. And it's very strange because you develop a dynamic for many years in the classroom to know what's going on in the classroom. I think it's like any good performer, right? When you're killing and when you're bombing. And it's hard to gauge that, especially when some of the students turn off. You don't know what they're doing behind there. And it presents all kinds of situations. Sometimes I've had students, I hope it wasn't my lectures or just my class, the way I was leading the class, falling asleep. You would think you would think they could at least turn off the screen if they're falling asleep. It just was not the same. But also I reached a point that I felt I wanted to devote more time to writing. But I must say, I think the situation with COVID kind of just pushed me a little bit even more quickly than I would have wanted maybe.
I think there's a number of professors who are in a very similar situation where they accelerated their retirement a little bit due to COVID and the pandemic.
Right. So I think I'm one of those faculty that decided to do that, partly because of it.
You're listed on Wikipedia as a notable Neorican. Would you tell us about that term and what it means to you?
Well, Neorican is a combination of the word New York and Puerto Rican. anyone who either was born from Puerto Rican ancestry, but was born in New York or grew up as myself. I was born in Puerto Rico, but I grew up in New York. And New York, pretty much, I mean, I consider myself a New Yorker. If you can tell traces still of my accent, is still there. I love New York. My wife and I go back a lot to just sort of energize ourselves. But it's basically that. It's just being a Puerto Rican, growing up with the experience of being a Puerto Rican, but living in New York. And because New York was the main sort of mecca for Puerto Ricans leaving the island, right? We ended up in the city. There was various neighborhoods that were, Puerto Rican. And that's sort of how migration works, right? People kind of go to places where we're already there. And so I grew up there, and a lot of my formative years were in New York City, but yet I always lived those two worlds, right? Being Puerto Rican, but also being, living in the United States and being American here. So that is pretty much an essence of my identity to a certain point.
And you use a pen name for your writing, which is where it seems to be an abbreviation somewhat of your given name.
Correct.
So can you tell us about how that came about?
All right. Well, my name is Jose Luis Torres, actually Jose Luis Torres Padilla, because we always include, in Hispanic culture, we always include the father and mother as part of our names, which I think is a good thing to do, actually. And I don't know. I guess it goes back to when I was just using Jose Torres, and there was a very popular boxer who also used to write columns, I think, for one of the newspapers. And so I said, I want to be a writer. This guy's already a writer, and I don't want to be confused with Jose Torres. So I was very much into D.H. Lawrence at the moment, and I thought E. Cummings was such a cool name, the way you lowercase and whatever. So let me just use my my initials, and so I just went with JL Torres. And to my chagrin, it seems like there's so many JL Torreses, because it's another thing. So Jose Torres is a common name, it really is. So maybe JL Torres will just make me stand out. And if you Google JL Torres, there's so many JL Torreses. And that doesn't mean that we're all Jose Luis. I mean, it could be one Jose, one Jorge Luis. There's a lot of combos like that with the JL. So, so it wasn't as original as I thought it would be, but that's the story behind my pen name.
Well, imagine what it's like being a Karen, especially these days.
Oh yeah. I sympathize. Do you have a problem? I mean, do you still sort of people go, oh, Karen?
Yeah, it's a little cringy still. Yeah. Well, and also there's not a lot of young people these days being named Karen, so it's going to be a middle-aged woman most likely.
Yes. Well, names go in cycles, don't they? I mean, there was a time there when, I have a good gauge of that, because, I would see young people coming in, right? A new generation every time, first year students, and you can see the names in cycles. I mean, I would sometimes, at one point I had Britneys. I mean, I had so many Britneys in my classes, So it goes in cycles, and maybe Karen will someday come back. I don't know, but names are a strange thing, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Jose is not the one thing I decided. My two sons, I was not going to name them Jose. I told my wife, there's no way there's going to be a junior because I don't want to make them go through what I went through with. No, I'm serious. I mean, I remember being in the mall in Puerto Rico and somebody yelling, Jose. 15 guys turned around. I mean, it was that way. It was like, oh man, this is not a good name to have. So, what can I say about it? So JL Torres it is.
Well, I have to admit that when I did a search for you, to do research for this podcast, you were the only one who popped up as an author. So that's good.
Well, that is good. Yeah. I don't think there is another author, JL Torres. There's a lot of good Puerto Rican writers, but no JL Torres. So, or even Jose that I can come off with immediately. So yeah, true.
So belongingness is an important theme in your life and work. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay. that comes from living in these two worlds, two cultural, and cultures are really different in many ways. And I use the metaphor that I feel like I'm in perpetually in a hallway. This is the metaphor I use to kind of explain this in-betweenness, because it's sort of like you're in the hallway, and this hallway has sort of a connection. It's very tenuous, this connection between two rooms, right? And even if I decide to go into one of those rooms, I always feel like I'm still in the hallway. So I lived, many years in the U.S. in different places. I've lived in Puerto Rico. I was born there. So the first memories I have were in Puerto Rico, and I still have very strong memories. And then I went back when I was 26 or something to just, write and find my roots. And I thought I was going to go back to the US, but I stayed. And even after I married, I went back, and one of my sons was born there. So I always feel I never felt really comfortable there. I never felt comfortable in the United States. I still don't. When I went back, I sometimes had problems with Puerto Ricans, and they had problems with me because, they called me a Neorican, and that's not a good word in Puerto Rico. You're a Neorican. They're telling you, you're not really a Puerto Rican. You're not a genuine. You're sort of already tarnished or something. You've lost your Puerto Ricanness, which is a very cruel thing to tell somebody who is very much in love with his country and who wants to, be there to help and to feel like you're doing something for your country. So it was, that was rough. So, and I couldn't take it there for long. There's a lot of problems in Puerto Rico. And my wife, who is Puerto Rican, but was born actually in the United States, she said, and her parents are Puerto Rican, whatever. She was like, I can't take this anymore, so we had to come back. So I always feel like I'm not really belonging in either way. And then it raises all kind of questions. What does it mean to belong? Because I hear other people who go, my people go back generations in this town. I'm like, wow, what must that be like? I don't know what that's like. And I think it must be a good thing, but I don't know. I'm trying to figure out where I belong. I don't feel American. I don't feel Puerto Rican. So I'm sort of in that in between.
Yeah, my husband, as an immigrant to the U.S., often says a very similar sentiment of not feeling like he totally belongs in the U.S., but also not really feel like he belongs in his home country anymore because he's been in the U.S. for so long. So it is an interesting, in-betweenness.
Absolutely. But with us, it's even more complex because we're U.S. citizens. I mean, I was born a citizen of the United States, but I don't feel American, which is odd. How many people can say that? Well, I was born in Texas. I don't feel American. It's because it's very unique to us that we are sort of, let's be honest and call it what it is. It's a colony. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. People say territory, but that's a nice way of saying. Nobody wants to say colony anymore in the 21st century, but that's what we are. And so because we were given really this citizenship and not a bad thing to get in some ways, but we really didn't have a say. We had no chance to think about this. We had no vote. They just gave it to us. Why? Because the year was 1917 and, the United States was going into the First World War, which imagine just going into something this big at that moment. We never had a world war, right? So we need everyone we can get. And let's get some of those Puerto Ricans. They're sort of semi-citizens, so we will just give them citizen because you can't really draft anybody who's not. So let's just give them citizenship and basically draft them and send them off to war. That's the reason why we're citizens. And so, the former president wanted to see, can you take it away from them? He actually said that. And I said, wow. After all those years, you want to take it away from us. That's brutal, man. And we still are trying to figure out if we want to be a state or just be independent. So we haven't decided, which makes it still more of a dilemma and this indifference. But not indifference, it's just inertia. We just can't seem to decide what we want. And that adds to this perpetual feeling of being in between, It's a real problem.
I want to talk a little bit about your novel that you wrote called The Accidental Native. Tell us what you believe makes this book unique.
Well, it is the only book written in English or Spanish that is about the return migration, of Puerto Ricans going back to Puerto Rico. Oddly enough, there was never anything written on it. And I love Toni Morrison's comment that if there is no book there that you want to read, then write it. That's exactly what I did. So that's unique that way. Because I think you find in there the sort of the microaggressions that Neoricans experience when they go back. And this young man, Renny Falto, it doesn't want to be there, but he loses his what he thought was his parents. And he did lose his father, but his mother was not. His mother was really a stepmother. But for reasons that you find out later in the book, he discovers that his real mother is still living in Puerto Rico. And that's what brings him back, because he wants to now sort of, at first not, because he was upset with her, but then he decides, what do I have to lose? Let me just go over there. Maybe I can find out what my mother really is like. So he goes through a whole series of adventures in Puerto Rico, learning about the country and trying to navigate those waters as somebody who really in many ways is a foreigner, right? Because he was completely assimilated.
What did you find most challenging about writing this book?
Well, I was already in my 50s already, but, and I was trying to write a 27-year-old, because I remember when I got there, and trying to bring up those memories. And that was very challenging. And just trying to remember and include so many things that I could have written, and kind of bringing them together in a story. And then, using my imagination to create situations that obviously were not true, historical or otherwise, but to make the story a good story. And it's hard to write about those experiences, not being wanted and feeling sort of alienated in your own homeland. But I think that also helped me write a better story. So I think challenging was that, how do I write from a 27-year-old's perspective, right? When I'm already in midlife. Yeah.
What made you decide to go with younger main character?
I don't know. I thought I really was just trying to think how I felt back then, because now I have some distance, and I just felt the story would be fresher. I think, I don't know, that's the main thing. I just wanted to kind of recreate that feeling that when I was there, everything was new, everything was fresh. I don't have, when I left Puerto Rico, I was pretty, it was dark for me. I mean, I just really was not very, very sort of not accepting of what was going on in the island, very depressed about it, really. And so I didn't want to write about that. I wanted to write about someone that's just entering this new country and young and vibrant. And, I like to think that I'm vibrant even on my age. It just seems a different story with a younger person. That's basically it.
And what do you love most about the book?
I love that it brings so many different things. At one hand, it's a book about a Neorican going to the island, but because everything's new, you get a sense. People who have read it says, wow, I feel like you give me a sort of the panorama of Puerto Rico. Now I know, like, I'm very descriptive, and there were different, because at one point the mother decides you need an education about Puerto Rico, because she's a very strong woman and a lawyer, and she's a force to be reckoned with. And she decides that if you're my son, you need to know about your history and your background. So she takes them to all these different parts of Puerto Rico to give them sort of so it's a sort of a traveling book. It's a book about the academy, because it deals about being in college. It's also an environmental book, because it deals with the issues of vieques in a certain point, but also that on the campus that he's working, which, and this is true, the campus that I was working at the University of Puerto Rico in Calle, which is my hometown, actually they buried armaments somewhere on the campus, and then they had to dig them up and clean them up. But apparently, maybe the damage was done, and who knows what kind of pollution was there. And so I also found it very strange in my building, in the school, there were so many cases of cancer. It's like, this is weird. So maybe not, maybe so, but I don't know. But using my imagination, I think, let's suppose in this particular case that, yeah, all that stuff was creating a real, and it's another way of my getting into, I am environmentalist. I am very, very, very committed to those issues. I'm very concerned about climate, the climate crisis. And Puerto Rico, which is a beautiful island. I don't know if you've ever gone, Karen, but it's truly beautiful. I mean, as an island, it's a tropical island, or islands, because we really are an archipelago, and it's being destroyed. It's being polluted, and partly it's on us, but all these pharmaceuticals and different kinds of corporations and companies that come there to pollute without even thinking about cleaning it. So it's a real issue that I also want to include in the story. So what I like about this book, and I feel very proud that I've taken all these threads and kind of weaved them into a story that I feel is a good read. So I'm very proud of that. And I think that that's something that readers will like.
And you've released a collection of stories called Migrations. Tell us about that collection.
All right, that's just came out in June. And that book, I was looking more at history. I wanted to really delve into Puerto Rican history and those moments, which I think are very important. And those, historical moments are not just about, narratives about what happened, but it happened to people. And I wanted to take those people, Puerto Ricans, and put them in narrative form so that people can know about their history, but also how it has an impact on human beings. So each one of these stories is in one way some historical moment, and not just the past. There's several that take place in the past, but some of them are in the present. The first story begins in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, and it goes all the way to the near future when Puerto Rico is a sovereign nation, only because of climate change. The U.S. is a mess, and they say, we'll let you go. You're on your own, which almost is parallel to why they gave us citizenship, right? I can just see them saying, well, it's such a mess that we can't take care of this country anymore. Like, you guys are on your own. So it happens, that's the case. And then the last story is sort of a compilation allegory of history, like 500 years of Puerto Rican history, and sort of an allegory that I have fun with. And the main character is a little person, named Pedro Rico. So that is Migrations, and I'm very proud of this book. It won an award, which I'm very proud of, the Tomas Rivera Book Prize, mainly because Tomas Rivera was a wonderful educator himself and seminal. He's not Puerto Rican, but he was Mexican-American and a great literary icon of the Chicano Renaissance. So that they have a prize this is the inaugural, this is the first prize that I got. I'm very proud of it. I didn't think I was going to get it, but it's one of those things like, whoa, yes, thank you. So I'm very proud of this collection. And I think there's a little bit of something for everyone in these 11 stories.
And what do you enjoy about writing short stories that you may not get from writing a novel?
Oh, if I could just write short stories, I am a student of the short story. When I teach fiction, and I teach short stories to students, I love teaching them, especially the creative writers that I taught, about the intricacies of it, the challenges of short stories, but the joy in being able to write something within a condensed period of time. A novel, my God, it takes forever, it seems. And there's just so many obstacles, where short stories, when you got the knack for them, this when there's a click, it clicks and it just works. And that's what I'm always striving for in a short story. I love writing complex characters within a short period of time, because I think it's more of a challenge. So I just love the short story. I already have an idea for another collection already in my mind. I like to write thematic ones. This is sort of thematic because I think in today's publishing climate, people kind of gravitate, I think, to thematic collections. The day of compiling things, and people go, oh, okay, they will, but I think they want something to coalesce, something to connect somehow. So my next collection of short stories will center around Central Park. That's all I'm going to say.
Oh, I love that idea. That's fantastic.
So I just think it'll be a great idea. So that's where I'm going to go with that.
Yeah,
requires a little research.
That's fantastic. I love that idea, and I can't wait to read it.
Okay. Yeah.
So
hopefully it'll be sooner than later.
What book has influenced you the most?
Wow, you just bring it. This is great timing. I just finished a listicle. That's a new word for me. Do you know what the listicle is?
No, you enlighten me about a listicle.
A listicle is an article that contains a list in it, and it's comprised mainly of a list. And that's exactly what I wrote. Ben Fox, who is the founder of Shepherd for Authors. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he has a website to help authors and also to have people connect with topics that they might not know about. So I think it's a great idea for a website. And he said, would you like to write one? I said, yeah, I would. And so the topic that I picked was the best novels or best books from writers of the Diasporican, all right, or the diaspora, Puerto Rican diaspora. But to come up with 5 books was so hard. And all those 5 books, I can tell you, go to them, because they all had an impact, some more than others, really. But at least 3 that I can tell you definitely, really 2. The Family Installments, which was by Edward Rivera. And he wrote it as a novel, and it is a novel, but in those days, I think if you were Latino, you should make it seem like your autobiography, because it's going to sell more. And he said, this is a novel. Even though it might have autobiographical elements, it's a novel. But he had a hard time with that. But that book is a fantastic novel. It really, if you want to know about the diaspora, especially in the 1950s, read that book and you'll get the gamut. Everything that has to do with that experience, including going, for many, not me, but there were many Puerto Ricans that went to Catholic school. He went to Catholic school. So a lot of it is very funny, those chapters. So that book, definitely, I read it and I really identified with the main character, because he was a young boy who was very creative, imaginative. He loved to read, and I love to read. And I felt, oh, wow, this guy is just like me. He wants to read, and he loves literature, and he's very much into the words. So that definitely. And then the other book is a book that a lot of people know, is P.D. Thomas's Down These Mean Streets. That was actually the first book I read about Puerto Ricans. I had never read a book about Puerto Ricans. I grew up loving literature, in a special course that it was advanced English, but that's all we read. In those days, and I still always remember what Abraham Rodriguez was told. He was a Puerto Rican writer, younger than me. And he wrote this wonderful novel, Spider Town. But when he was in high school, he told one of his English teachers, I want to be a writer. And he laughed. He said, no, there's such thing as Puerto Rican writers. That's what he told him. So I'm like, wow. And that still resonates with me, because I was never told that. But it wasn't like, here's a book written by this Puerto Rican. So when P.D. Thomas came out with that book in 1965, I want to say, and I was only 13, maybe 14, a teenager, I really identified with that book, even though his life was nothing like mine. I mean, he was in gangs. gangs. He committed robberies. He was a drug addict. It was one of those 60s books about the ghetto, right? Sort of man-child in the promised land, that kind of thing. So that was sort of the Latinx version of it. And even though I said, okay, this, I'm not a gang. I'm not shooting a heroin, I didn't shoot a cop in jail. But the family structure, the moments in his home, I identified very much with. So that was the first time that I read a book that had people like me in it. And that book very much, and for many of us, by the way, Juno Diaz mentions that book, as he mentions family. So that book was very important. Those two books for me, absolutely defining moments in my reading.
What advice would you have for people who would like to write a book but are afraid or maybe aren't sure where to start?
Tell them, everyone has at least one story, right? One bookend, though I really believe that. But if it takes a lot. I'm not going to say it's easy, but if you really have to want to tell that story. You want to do it. You should do it. Absolutely do it, because you're always going to have regrets if you don't. So do it. And how do you start? I always start by writing my ideas down. You know what I mean? But that's me. How do you get from an idea to the beginning of the writing is part of the journey. And I think I would tell you, think about it a lot, write down notes, and kind of maybe form something so that you don't sit down like some people do and they do this, that's their method. They just start writing. But I've tried that, and sometimes I write 40 pages and it's going nowhere because I really didn't know where I was going. So I said, no, I'm going to think a little bit before I begin writing. Any project I do, I think, I read, I research, I think about it, and then I have some kind of plan. I don't call it an outline, I call it a plan. This is my plan, right? That has sequences and whatever. And then from there, I take it one kind of event at a time, one step or chapter at a time, and do the writing. I believe very strongly when anyone who's listened to this and wants to follow that advice, once you start writing, do not worry about what you put down. That is something that so many people stalls people, or they start writing and they see the cursor just blinking and they get stuck. It doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, I'm a big proponent of shitty first drafts. That is, and you probably know it. Shitty first drafts is a great essay. And I forgot, is it Elamont? I don't know if it is, but I said this is revolutionary in many ways because she's saying exactly what we all should realize, that the first drafts are not going to be good. Okay, don't even think they're going to be good. Okay, just write it, put it down, and if you can get a book, the draft, and then you go back and then you go through revision. And believe me, you're going to go through a lot of revision to get to where you want to go. But at least you have something down. Rather than that's what I think, that when people have ideas for writing a book or they want to write a book, that's what kills them. It's like they can't, they just can't start because they don't know how. Preparation, what we call pre-writing, just take some time thinking about the idea, working on it. If you have to read other things, whatever, then get an idea. This is where I want to go. I want to go here, 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 here. I mean, basic outline, and then just write it, and don't be afraid of how good it is at the the preliminary draft.
Yeah, I love the idea of calling it a plan rather than an outline, because an outline seems to stall a lot of people because they think of academics and
right, 1A, B, C. No, just write like I'm going to do this first. Number one. It doesn't have to be like this is, and then 2 will be this, and then something like that. Just something simple that can get you started, but at least give you direction. Because writing it, you need some kind of direction. You can change the direction, but you need to at least get an idea. This is where I want to go.
I think a lot of people get stalled too because they tend to compare their original writing with the first draft to other people's finished draft, not realizing that writer went through probably 100 revisions before they got to that more perfect place with their writing. So you can never compare what you're doing with your first draft with something that's already been published.
Yeah, I think that really is the innocence, maybe, or the ignorance, whichever way you want to call it, people who see a book, they don't realize, my goodness, how much work goes into it and how much revision goes into it. All the greats. One thing I used to always do, the Paris Review had these wonderful interviews with all kind of great writers, and they used to have a wonderful page of usually a draft page. And I used to show that to my students. This is Hemingway. And so the circling and crossing out, and this is what the great writers do, and that's what you're going to do also. You need to do that. You need to understand that it's not going to be perfect the first time, and you're going to go through all kinds of drafts. You're going to changes and throwing things in the garbage. When we had typewriters, right? Now just erasing everything. Or even if you get a draft, sometimes you just I had a novel early on when I started, complete it, and I just threw it away. And I wish I had it. because I think, see, I felt that it wasn't good enough. And I said, well, I could have maybe with a little bit more of craft and knowledge, I could have maybe taken that. And now I feel maybe made it into a book, but it's lost. So it's gone. But that's good. You're right. You're absolutely right that they're unaware of that. And that's learning that is important to keep you going.
If you were having a dinner party, what 3 writers, living or dead, would you most want to invite?
Oh, my goodness. Wow. I don't know, Fitzgerald, maybe, because he's a great short story writer and he had a lot of fun. I think he had a lot of fun. I would not invite his wife, but I would invite him. Another writer that I really like is Borges. I think I would invite Borges. And maybe a third writer. Well, I don't know. I can't come up with a third writer right now, but I know later on I will. I'll email you. I don't know, because those two just stand out for me, and I don't know, do I go old? Do I go new? I never had a chance to talk to Toni Morrison. That's what since she's now not living, even if she were, but I would have loved to pick her brain.
That's a great pick. Great pick.
As a woman of color, writing in all the obstacles she had to face, what advice she can give, right?
Yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah, excellent.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything else you'd like to tell us about you or your work?
I don't know. I read the books, and I really wish that people would read them and contact me. I'm very open to criticism. You know what I mean? I just like other writers, you read some of these comments in Goodreads, and I say, if I could just talk to this person, because sometimes I don't think they understand exactly where I'm coming from, or I think, wow, you said that, but why did you say that? So if they read and just drop me a line anywhere they want, whether social media or my email or my website, and tell me what you think. I really, especially this last collection, because I just don't feel like I'm getting the feedback on it. I've had people tell me, oh, I love it, but they're not the ones writing on Goodreads. Or, and these are people that I trust. It's not like, oh, I don't want to hurt Jose's feelings. And, they know better than that. I can take criticism. I have a thick skin as a writer. But it's just, you always want to know what people are thinking about what you're writing and if I've hit the mark or not, So that's what I would like them. Personally, I'm just a guy trying to figure it out, what it's like to be in that hallway all the time and figure what does that mean? And going forward, pretty much that. Yeah. And by the way, I love other things. I love film. I love music. I love all other things. It's not just, I'm a person like other people that has a lot of different, complexities and whatever. I'm just not focused on this issue that I do like.
So what movies would you recommend if someone came to you and said, what movie do you really love that we should watch? What would you say?
Well, I love Apocalypse Now. That was to me, a movie that really, and recently, about 5 years ago, but I saw this movie. It was a Japanese film called Departure, and it was one of the most powerful films I have ever seen. Oddly, it's a movie about death. But you realize that really in learning about death, this is a guy who's a musician, and his orchestra, I guess for some reason, is disbanded, and he's out of a job. And now what does he do? All he knows how to do is play a cello. And so now he goes and becomes one of the lowest jobs you can have in Japan, which is an undertaker, our equivalent of an undertaker. And in dealing with death all the time, obviously, there's so much that you learn. But the most powerful scene I still remember, one day when he came from a really bad day, dealing with that. He went home and he was so passionate with his wife, and just the intensity in which he made love to her was so life affirming. It was almost like death is too soon and we have to live. It was just a beautiful film. And then at the end, I don't want to give the end because then but at the end it's so touching that there's a very few films that I should cry. I kind of like, because sort of the code of the film is really powerful. And if you see it, you'll see it. It's called Departure. Not Departure is the one with Leonardo covered, but Departure, a Japanese film. I should know the director, but I don't. That's a film that I think everyone should. And Apocalypse Now is just a great film that's an adaptation of a great novella.
What TV show have you recently binged on Netflix?
Oh, believe it or not, Ted Lasso is what I've been watching. I mean, I just love the guy. I mean, it's such a great, it's silly in many ways, you know what I mean? It plays on so many like cliche tropes and whatever. Sudeikis does a great job to me. I mean, he just naturally seems fit. And he has his demons. This is what I like now. It's getting a little darker in the second season. And you begin to see that this is now a character that has some room to grow. And there's stuff going on there that makes him even more interesting. There's another show that we were watching. My wife said, you should have told him about Raimi, because that's another show. I don't know if you're familiar with it, that we started watching. And at first, but then it just got better and better, because I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a Muslim family, basically, but it's a young guy, American, who's also Muslim, and he wants to connect to his religion. And, it's kind of comical because he really is sometimes clueless and sometimes awkward. This is why I really felt a lot for this character, because he's straddling these two cultures and he's trying to figure it out, right? And it's really a great show because it also gets into the rest of the family. It's not just about him. And so I would recommend that to everybody, because we've been watching it religiously, no pun intended.
Where can listeners find out more about you?
My author page is JL Torres writer.com. I also do a blog called Post Barrio Universe, where I basically write about sort of the nexus between culture and politics, but from a Latinx perspective. So if they're interested in those topics, I do reviews of books. I write essays on sort of contemporary topics. Now that I'm retired, I hope to submit a little bit more often, because I've been sluggish. And on Twitter, I'm on Twitter, Rican_writer. You can find me also on Instagram. I'm not a big Instagram. I just don't know. That has to be a young thing, because I just don't have the time to take pictures all the time. Just, Google JL Torres and I think you'll find me.
Your books are available on Amazon.
Really anywhere, Barnes & Noble. I've Googled to see that anywhere that you feel comfortable buying books and you want to support that particular bookseller, check it out. If not, then ask them for it.
It was great to have you on the show, JL. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Karen, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. Where is the largest Puerto Rican community outside of Puerto Rico? New York City is said to have the largest population of Puerto Ricans outside Puerto Rico itself, and New York State has more Puerto Ricans than any other state in the USA. We'll end the show with something punny. If a book is channeled through a Ouija board, is it ghost-written? Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.